The Purchase Funeral Home in El Paso has been overwhelmed with work over the last year. So overwhelmed, in fact, that they had to convert the chapel into a refrigerated morgue.
My name is Jorge Ortiz, and I am a general manager representing Purchase Funeral Homes here in El Paso, Texas.
We first heard from Jorge back in November. El Paso was underwater, an early victim of the rising tide of COVID-19 cases in Texas. This is what he said back then.
The last 2 weeks, we have received more COVID cases than the past, I would say, months. When we hit the peak back in maybe the summer, that's nothing compared to what we're living right now. See, we have, directors who are meeting with 5-6 families a day, and this is every single day. It's nonstop.
Most other cities in Texas have since joined El Paso. The state is one of the worst places in the nation to be as far as COVID-19 infections and deaths go.
It's very hard just to know how to manage the workload beyond the scenes and then still be there for the family. And then you have these emotions because you feel it. You're there with the family in the entire process. Many families had lost their loved ones, and they haven't been there when they have passed. And they just took them to emergency. They left them there, and next time they saw them was 2 weeks later when they passed away. They saw them in a coffin. They saw them in the funeral home. There's many stories where family members have not only lost one family member, but they lost both of their parents, and then brothers, and sisters, other siblings, and it's a sad story. I think the hardest that I have encountered is the passing of our director. We lost one of our team members due to COVID complications. One of our funeral directors unfortunately passed away. Mr. Harrison Johnson, he definitely was a stupendous person. He was just great. When you know someone so close, I think that's when it really hits you.
At this point, it's hit a whole lot of us. From Texas Public Radio and the Texas Newsroom, this is Petrie Dish. I'm Bonnie Petrie, and today, life and loss. Grieving the worst year of our lives. This week, we've reached a devastating milestone. 400,000 Americans dead of COVID-19. Every one of those 400,000 people is one person to someone's baby, maybe someone's parent, their partner, their friend. That means millions of Americans are grieving, and funeral directors like Jorge are trying to help them through it while also trying not to succumb to their own crushing grief. Around 11 hours away from El Paso, all the way across Texas along I-10 in Houston, Joseph Earthman is also doing that. He owns Generations Funeral Home in Houston. You can hear him there walking through a church at a funeral. The soft sounds of a Gregorian chant in the background. These rituals of grief, sitting Shiva if you're Jewish, awake for many Christians and even people who aren't religious. Funerals. There are as many death rites as there are cultures and families in the United States. And Earthman says they all matter.
I think the rituals are vital.
He says that public acknowledgement of who and what you've lost, shared with others who are also grieving, can help people start to process what's happened to them. Without these rituals, people are left to grieve in silence, Husbands, wives, partners. They're forced to carry this pain alone.
And now what has happened is 4 months later is you've got a widower who is in the throes of what I think, professional therapists refer to as complicated grief, because they didn't have the ability to publicly grieve.
Complicated grief, also known as persistent complex bereavement disorder, is grief that doesn't subside over time. It sometimes intensifies. A survivor isn't able to accept their loss and start to build a life without their person. They remain in deep mourning during a time when so many people can't visit their sick loved ones in the hospital. They can't be by their side, holding their hand as they die. The need to have that kind of closure often goes unfulfilled. Earthman thinks that might be behind the return of a ritual of grief that would have been quite familiar to our great-grandparents.
So, for example, the person who died was COVID positive, okay? After a certain amount of time, there's no real threat of contagion. Because the person was separated from the family for however long they were in the hospital, families now, because of an instinctive desire to be near physically to the person who died, we're having families ask, well, can the deceased come back home?
Yes, they can, Earthman says.
The deceased is brought back home in a casket, just like the olden days. The family will have their visitation at their own home. And then the next morning, we would send the hearse over to the house, and then we would go to church and then to the cemetery, or we would go to the crematory after the church. And what this accomplishes is, because the deceased, especially during this pandemic, is separated from the family, it allows the family now an opportunity to have that closeness that they didn't have at the time of death. And it really, really helps with the families making sense of what has happened.
As Earthman told me about this old custom coming back, my eyes filled with tears. I know some people might find having a dead loved one laid out in your home strange or even creepy, but I don't. I think it would be comforting to have someone you love and lost at home, even just for a little while, so you could sit with them and, talk with them before trying to figure out how to let them go.
I've heard so many times during eulogies where people would say, I wish I could just have one more conversation with them. And I feel like saying, you kind of can. You can.
You can. Anytime you can talk to them. Even right now you can, if you want to. How does the world survive a pandemic? How do humans survive burying millions of their mothers and fathers, their children, their brothers, their sisters, their partners, their friends? How do we survive, pressed under the weight of all of those deaths? How do we go on? What does that even look like? We know it can be done. We humans did it just over a century ago. In 1918, influenza raced around a world at war, killing 50 million people, a third of the world's population. The United States was not spared.
They lost 675,000 Americans, and most of those deaths were in a relatively finite period of about 6 months, coming right at the end of the war and in the winter months immediately following. And that is very hard to imagine in a population of 100 million people, that everyone would have known someone, right? Everybody knew someone. Everyone was affected in some way by this.
Nancy Bristow is a historian, the chair of the history department at the University of Puget Sound. She wrote the book, American Pandemic, the lost worlds of the 1918 influenza epidemic.
It happened at the same time as World War I. It killed vastly more Americans, vastly more people, human beings worldwide, and yet it didn't make a public mark in the culture. So it's not memorialized. World War I has its own holiday. Veterans Day was once Armistice Day, celebrating the end of World War I. There's no holiday, obviously, but there's also no memorials. There's very little public conversation about it in the months and years afterward.
Most of us know a lot about the two world wars of the 20th century, but about the 1918 flu, then known by many as the Spanish flu, there was relative silence for decades.
So the women in their letters, how saddened they were or troubled during an illness, and then how devastated they were by the losses. There's quite a bit less of that in men's correspondence. Men were really expected to be brave and to be resilient and to be hardy and not to get sick and not to cry. And so it's a relatively subdued grief. And publicly, there were no major funerals or public events expressing the losses. The President of the United States never spoke about the pandemic over its entirety, which means 675,000 American citizens died, and he never spoke to that grief, never mentioned it, never said he was saddened by it.
There are reports of funeral bells for the dead tolling all day, every day, for weeks. But after the pandemic ended, it's almost as though the population collectively agreed to never speak of it again. Bristow says part of that may be because it didn't really fit in with how Americans wanted to see themselves back then.
We are an exceptional people, always on the rise, always wanting to talk about our progress. World War I fit that story beautifully. It was contemporaneous with the flu. The flu said we are just like everybody else. Science cannot yet save us. We are like everyone else. We can be brought to our knees, by an illness just like anyone else. That story didn't sell very well with Americans at that historical moment when we were seeing ourselves as triumphant on a world stage.
When I reached out to Dr. Bristow, I had a couple of theories. One, that the silence may have been, in part anyway, because the grief was just unspeakable. It was too painful to remember, to reflect on that time when people were just dying all around you, so many and so quickly. In Philadelphia, 12,000 people died of the flu in a month. People draped their homes in black crepe when the flu had taken one or many of the people inside. Entire neighborhoods were draped in black. Horses drew wagons up and down the streets of the city as city workers looked for sackcloth-shrouded corpses left on porches, corpses by the street, corpses in mass graves. Not because people didn't care about those who had died, but because the undertakers and the graveyards had no room for all of them. Death everywhere. In many places in 1918, public funerals were banned, that ritual of shared grief that can help people start to process loss together. They didn't happen. People carried their pain alone and didn't speak of it. Bristow says she didn't know how personally her own family had been touched by the flu in 1918.
I was looking around for something to study. I was a historian of the First World War era. I'd written a book engaged, at least in part, in issues around how disease is understood. But I didn't know what to study next. And in a conversation with my father, I suddenly discovered that my two great-grandparents had died in the flu pandemic. I simply hadn't known that.
Her grandfather, with whom she was close, was one of the hundreds of thousands of American orphans of the 1918 pandemic, and she simply hadn't known it. They didn't talk about it. But then years of anguish wrought by war and disease gave way to a new age.
An era of great prosperity, a great explosion in American culture, all kinds of new things emerging, gets referred to as the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties.
The Roaring Twenties, reckless and wild. The survivors of the fraternal twin tragedies of war and disease careened from 1920 toward the crash of 1929, almost as though they were trying not to think about something. Almost as though they were trying to outrun something. That looks familiar to me. It looks like grief, or actually a reaction to grief, a rejection of it, denial, compartmentalization, a collective throwing off of the cloak of pain associated with grief.
I think that's surely part of it. And the distinction I would draw is only that that's not going to be everyone. That those who are really suffering through the losses, those who are still grieving, are not throwing it all off. Some of them may have tried to solve their loss that way, but many others, I'm sure, continue just to suffer without the opportunity to speak to it or to be embraced about it.
And yet, many of the young adults of the 20s seized their destinies, no longer darkened by death, in a dramatic way. Women bobbed their skirts and their hair and joined young men at speakeasies for illegal drinking. Yes, it was the time of prohibition, raucous parties, and dancing the Charleston. The young adults of this decade were the teens and tweens of that world self-destructing just a few years before. These young adults seemed to be done with all of that. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. They wanted freedom. They wanted to live. What might that tell us about how our kids might react to growing up surrounded by so much death?
It's certainly a question that I am interested to watch unfold, which is, what is this going to mean for the very young, for my little niece who's in second grade this year, or my, another niece who's in kindergarten this year? What is this going to mean for my college students who've had their first year of college from the basement of their family's home? What is this going to mean for these different generations of people? How will it play out? And what will the long-term shaping of us be?
A note before we leave 1918 and return to our own pandemic and our own grief. It's interesting to me that the catastrophes of the late 19-teens launched the jazz age as we talk about the impact our pandemic has had on American jazz today. I asked Dr. Bristow about that.
It's a parallel for me between the two pandemics, and it's the most tragic of the parallels, which is, we can talk about the failure of presidential leadership. You can talk about the ways in which we had to rely on local heroes to guide us through the pandemic. But the thing that strikes me so powerfully about the similarities between the two is the way both have landed so inequitably among us, and the profound harm and injury by way of death and suffering that's being done to our communities of color in 2021 and 2021 was mirrored back in the day. The ongoing racial inequity in our country, the class and racial split that has life and death consequences for people, and that we failed to deal with in the aftermath of 1918. Lord knows, I hope we can at least take some lessons, is too trite, but that we can learn some more about what we are failing at right now.
Fast forward a century from grief to grief. Yes, we're all grieving right now, but it is clear that this pandemic has had an outsized impact on certain populations. Essential workers have been hit hard, and the essential workers ordered to work during the pandemic, those who work at meatpacking plants, have just been devastated. During the first 5 months of the pandemic in the U.S., up to 8% of coronavirus cases could be traced to workers at meatpacking plants, according to a study by researchers from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And the people who work at meatpacking plants, who keep that uninterrupted supply of affordable food on our tables, are mostly Black or brown and often immigrants. And they have families too, families that depend on them, Families that too often have been left to fend for themselves while trying to make sense of overwhelming loss. KERA's reporter Stella Chavez has been following a family grappling with that loss.
Yeah, last spring, I spoke with the family of Hugo Dominguez. He was a 36-year-old man who worked at Quality Sausage. It's a meat processing plant in Dallas. He worked in shipping and receiving. He died the day after the plant had temporarily halted production because of the rising number of COVID cases. There were actually 2 workers that we know of who died. The family ended up suing the company. They were very upset and, in their lawsuit alleged that the company did not provide any training or protective gear for their employees.
One of the most common feelings associated with grief is anger.
Okay, we're ready?
And in this case, anger seems justified. The family says the company didn't protect its workers.
My name is Carlos Quintanilla. I am with Activista Legal Acción America.
They were very angry. I mean, during the press conference, Blanca, his wife or longtime partner, spoke. She just talked about how he, was very important to her. He was not only her, longtime partner, but he was also the father of her children. They had 3 children together. He was the breadwinner. He was the person who he was the leader of the family. And so losing him has had a huge impact on their lives, not just financially, but emotionally as well.
That was several months ago. Now, after that initial flurry of distracting activity that surrounds a death and that first surge of anger starts to subside, that's often when the hard work of grieving really begins. So how's Blanca doing now?
Blanca talks about how it seems like people only focus on what happens to them naturally. People are most concerned about themselves and their own families. And she says they often forget what happens to others. She says only the ones who've lost people to COVID remember. Life is cruel, she says. And it's been cruel, she says, because, she's had to figure out how can I keep providing for my family? And they sometimes have to get food to eat from the local food pantry. She has a group of friends that she can talk to. She says she prays the rosary regularly. She has her faith, and that helps her keep going. And her children have her. They're just trying to get by, taking it one day at a time. I know from, personal experience, and also, my mom did this a lot. Sometimes praying the rosary can provide a sense of comfort. It sort of gives you this inner peace, and in some ways is a bit like meditation. So I know that she has said that, she finds solace in that, in just being able to rely on her faith or lean on her faith, I should say, to get through these really emotionally tough times.
And then we know the first holiday season after a loss can be difficult during normal times. How did Blanca and her kids navigate that series of emotional landmines?
Todas las navidades, todo el tiempo, porque él siempre está con nosotros.
And this year, she said it was just really different. It was really sad because he wasn't there. And she describes those days as like eating food without seasoning or flavor. Something is missing. She talks about how, seeing other people getting together to celebrate has been difficult because she feels like, many people have forgotten that there's a pandemic. And in her case, her family's case, they don't have the money to go out and buy, a bunch of presents. So because she works at the Salvation Army, she said that the Salvation Army provided some meals for her and her family. So there was at least some kind of celebration of the holidays, but it was completely, different from other times. She has set up an altar in her home, which is not uncommon in many Latino families, as a way to remember those that we've lost. And so she says she has on this altar in her home, she has photos of her parents and also photos of Hugo.
That's beautiful.
It is, yeah. It's a very nice image.
Thank you. Stella Chavez with KERA. Some of the greatest grief, the biggest grief of this pandemic is experienced every day by people who, in a way, have chosen it. No, they didn't choose this exactly, but they took on their profession because they wanted to help people. They wanted to care for people when they were sick. They wanted to help make them better. They're nurses, but even nurses weren't ready for this.
No, we expect to experience some level of death in our careers, but when you see patients, die multiple times throughout your 12-hour shift, or you're coding multiple patients throughout your shift and doing everything you can to preserve their quality of life, that is not anything that we can be prepared for. There's nothing that we get in nursing school that prepares us for that level of stress and grief, for that matter. The level of grief and burden that these nurses are carrying on their shoulders is just incredible.
Serena Bumpus is the director of practice at the Texas Nurses Association. I asked her to try to paint a picture for me of what it's like to work in a hospital right now as a nurse during an uncontrolled pandemic.
It is flailing chaos. It is just, it's really hard to describe unless you're in it. You literally are running up and down the hallways, just trying to address and meet needs. The biggest concern right now is the amount of PTSD that nurses are experiencing as a result of this pandemic and just the toll that it's taken on some of them. We haven't seen death like this before in our careers.
Despite the availability of approved vaccines, it will take a while for the current COVID surge to subside. Meanwhile, hospitals across the country are reaching and exceeding capacity. Makeshift COVID wards are assembled in tents and in every spare square inch of hospitals, even the hallways, sometimes even the gift shops. Nationwide, there are several thousand COVID deaths every day. Many healthcare workers have physically distanced themselves from their families, spouses, children, since the beginning of the pandemic. They don't want to make them sick. So many nurses feel cut off from their most important sources of support. And they can't just quit. Nurses are a human resource, a finite resource, and there's already a deep shortage. These are skilled positions. It takes years of education and training to become an ICU nurse. And nurses have lives outside of the hospital, too. They have families. And it's a pandemic for all of us.
We had placed my grandparents in a nursing home in January at the start of 2020. And, they closed everything down early March, which was really tough to go through that. And then in the first part of June, my grandmother, we received the call that she had tested positive for COVID. And they were moving her to a nursing facility that they had set up that was just taking care of the residents from that particular facility with COVID. And my grandfather had dementia, and my grandmother was his life. And so, he was very confused and didn't know where she was or why she was gone.
Bumpus's grandmother got COVID and was separated from her grandfather, who has dementia. He couldn't understand where his wife of 69 years had gone. At this point in the pandemic, back in June, the nursing home didn't allow visitors inside, so the family, including Serena, could only visit through his window. He'd point to his wife's bed. Where was she?
I think broken heart syndrome is very, very real. And he ended up passing away about 3.5 weeks after they were separated.
Bumpus's grandfather didn't die of COVID directly, but he might as well have. He was alone in his room without his beloved wife because she had COVID. His daughters and grandchildren could only comfort him from a distance through a window because of COVID. Bumpus's grandfather is never far from her thoughts, and there are a few things she hopes he knows for sure.
One, that I love him and I miss him terribly. And I hope that he is sitting in heaven somewhere in his chair with all of his dogs, drinking his beer and having a good time and just smiling down on all of us. And I know he's watching over us, and and I know he's waiting patiently for my grandmother to get up there and see him.
Bumpus's grandfather was 88. A long life, well lived, to be sure. But that didn't make losing him any easier for those who loved him. A colleague of mine, a fellow journalist and vice president of news at KERA in Dallas, Rick Holter, has been trying to work through all of that. And like journalists often do, he shared some of his story with his listeners. Here's Rick.
They buried my dad last spring. Normally, I'd say we buried him, but this is nothing like normal. I was 1,300 miles away working remotely at my dining room table. My sister, her husband, their son, they stood in a church cemetery in Maryland, socially distanced from the pastor and the grave itself. My brother and his wife were in the grass on the other side. So were a nephew and a niece. My other brother and his wife, they left separate ends of their house, drove separate cars. At the cemetery, he couldn't do more than crack open a car window. Quarantined. 10 people, 1 funeral, a pandemic-sized hole in our hearts. See, Dad had COVID-19. They tested him on a Thursday in April, the day his liver gave out, the day half my family made a final visit, and I got to FaceTime with him. He died Friday. The results came back Saturday. Positive. I'm a journalist. I read plenty of stories about nightmares in nursing homes, about the horrors of a loved one dying alone, of the daughter waving through a window, of the brother left to grieve long distance. Then it happened to me. I'm Richard Jr., the oldest of 4. He was Richard Holter Sr., Dick to his friends, a dairy farmer who just turned 92 the day before St. Patrick's. Time of death, 3:45 in the morning. Milking time. In our family, he was always the quiet one, the one who trudged out to round up the cows before dawn for 3/4 of a century, the one who spent more than a decade wheeling the love of his life and then dear friends around the retirement center, the one who was fiercely loyal to the Maryland Terrapins and whom I accompanied to ACC basketball tournaments for 30 straight years. The one who loved nothing more than sitting back with a grin while his kids, his grandkids, and then his great-grandkids chattered away at Sunday dinner. A man of deep faith and a clear tenor voice whose quiet strength won't soon be forgotten. The last year, day after day, it's been so easy to get lost in the numbers. The confirmed cases, the ventilator count, ICU capacity, and the deaths. In a way, my dad would have appreciated the numbers. He loves sports, loved to check the box scores in the paper every morning, loved to repeat them on the phone later that day, even if he'd read the same box score online the night before. The thing is, today, these numbers, everyone is one. Everyone is a Dick Holter. Way back, we're Norwegian Germans. A little stoic, not exactly emotional, not a lot of tears. A day after Dad died, I asked Alexa to play some background music. She obliged, as she always does. Then came Seasons of Love from Rent, a musical about AIDS based on an opera about tuberculosis, La Boheme, arriving in the middle of a pandemic that killed my dad. I grabbed my wife in a vicious hug, and I broke. For my dad, it would have been about 49,400,000 minutes, and not one of them wasted.
That's Rick Holter at KERA in Dallas and son of Dick Holter. So I wanted to check in with him as his grieving process continues to unfold. So I did. I sat down with him. Thank you, Rick, for sharing that beautiful tribute to your dad. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's been a little more than 9 months since it's happened. It's strange that they talk about waves of grief. It's more like kind of heartbeats of grief on the chart. It just hits. You feel it, and you just hope for a little bit more of a gap till the next time it hits.
So I've been exploring how the rituals of grief have changed over the course of the pandemic. And you're one of the many now who've had to grieve from a distance. You couldn't go to your dad's funeral. And for those who did, it was very different. Do you think that changed the way you began processing your grief?
It did change it for me. It's interesting because my mom died 14 years ago. And she had a brain disease, and it was a long illness, but quick end. I was, a couple time zones away at that time, so there were some parallels. But I got to go back. I got to do all the things you usually do in that situation, and this time I didn't. But it's interesting, the essay that we just heard was a real, that was my grief. I mean, in a lot of ways, certainly that was my immediate grief. I mean, I poured the energy and the frustration I probably would have had toward, being so far away and feeling powerless into doing that thing a journalists do, which is, getting it out behind a microphone and getting it out through your fingers when you're writing it. And, and creating that tribute was, kind of my way to get through it.
So now that you're approaching a year of distance from this difficult loss, do you want to say anything to those whose grief may be newer and still raw?
Well, you can get through it. I mean, that's the biggest thing. And things, and just because we grieve differently doesn't mean we don't grieve, or doesn't mean we, grieve wrong, which I think, everybody does. I mean, 9+ months later, I can look back and say, well, this is how I got through it. But it's not, none of the books, none of the tip sheets, none of the preparation, even when it's happening, can really prepare you for it. And it's different every time. And, so people, I think the hardest thing is people just beat themselves up for not doing the right thing. And it's like, there is no right thing. I mean, you just get through it however you can get through it.
Did anything about this process, losing your dad, grieving during a pandemic, Did any of it take you by surprise?
I think the thing about this process that surprised me most was the anger. Not anger at my dad or at my family, or, some people get kind of all caught up in that stuff, but the anger at the lack of value of those individual lives. And, the thing is, I've processed, but it hasn't dissipated. I mean, it's just as those numbers, just keep rolling up. It's like, the lack of empathy and the kind of dismissal, the idea of herd immunity. You've reported on this a bunch. Were true herd immunity to happen, it would be, millions of people dead in the United States alone. And that's probably been my hardest thing. I still have this kind of knot of anger inside that is going to take a long time to pass.
I think a lot of us are holding on to anger right now and not sure what to do about it, right? I mean, I'm not an angry person. I hate being angry. I hate feeling that way, but sometimes a wave of it just washes over me. I don't like it, but I know it's normal, so I just kind of try to breathe through it.
I will say that one thing this has changed me in a way, this whole experience. And traditionally I am a arc of history bends toward justice kind of guy. I've always been an optimist. It drives my wife crazy sometimes. I'm not as much of an optimist anymore. I hear news about the vaccines and it's super promising, but the hell we have to go through for the next 6 months or a year until we're really past this. It's great to have that long-term optimism, but, I think that's my other piece of advice to people is while we all have to find hope to hang on to, there's value in the clouds as well as the silver lining.
Thank you, Rick, for sharing your dad with us and sharing your grief. Now, before we go, I also talked to a professional. Dr. Stacy Obeid is a psychologist and associate professor at UT Health San Antonio. She says first, grief is normal for everyone right now. Sadness is normal. Let yourself feel that. But when should you feel concerned about what you're going through?
I would say is if you get to a point where you feel the feelings of sadness related to the loss that you experience are getting in the way of how you function. If you are not eating the way, I don't have an appetite anymore, or maybe you're using food to cope. It could be the opposite end too. Your sleep is different. You're not functioning at work the way you did. If you're noticing some change in how you function, whether it's work, friends, family, health, that's when I would say maybe it might be a good idea to speak with a professional about this.
Now, if you haven't ever sought out a mental health professional, I can tell you it can be confusing and overwhelming. There's so much information on the internet. And frankly, when you're already sad and just physically and emotionally exhausted, it can paralyze you and you never end up getting the help you need. So Obeid says Google may not be the best place to start.
If you have a primary care doctor, go see them first because number one, a lot of primary care doctors are equipped to manage grief. And if they are not, they can connect you with someone like me who can. If you don't have a primary care doctor, which we have a lot of folks who don't, the next phase I would say is find your county's mental health resource group.
That's when you use Google. Google your county's name and mental health services, get the number, and call them up, especially if you're under or uninsured.
And they will work with you. If you say, I don't have health insurance, how am I going to pay for this? They will work with you to get you resources and get you help. So I say all those things because I don't want someone to go without because, one, I don't know where to look, or two, I don't have health insurance, and so I guess I'm left out.
Okay, so another thing that's really helpful in times like these for people who are experiencing relentless grief and stress, like healthcare workers, is something Obaid calls psychological first aid.
And so it's an approach that you can use with individuals who have been through a natural disaster or a pandemic. It's essentially checking in with the person, making sure they feel, number one, they feel safe, that they feel they have, it's almost thinking about, a few people have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The primary level is their safety needs. So are you hungry? Do you need something to drink? So it's checking in on things like that. Can I get you something to drink? Do you need a place to go take a power nap? How can I help you in your immediate stressor right now?
And in the end, it's all about building resilience, which Obaid says she's seen in abundance during this pandemic. So how do I build resilience out of all this pain? How do you? Obaid says you start by looking at your strengths. What hard things have you done before that you didn't think you'd be able to do? What are you managing now under the weight of what was unimaginable adversity just a year ago? You're actually pretty strong, aren't you?
So I think just that small shift in I'm doing the best I can with what I have to work with is a really nice way to tap into that resilience piece, because it's there. I think sometimes life and our context have suppressed that. And so this is a way to bring that to the light, to show that it's in there. Let's just show it to your loved one, show it to yourself, show it to your community that you're still putting one foot in front of the other.
One foot in front of the other. Some days, that's all you've got. And on those days, that's enough. So, I've been having dreams lately. Lots of dreams. I don't often dream, but I've been dreaming lately. And these dreams are about my brother. You can hear him right there playing bass with his band Trouser. My brother died in May. He was 49. He was 10 and a half months younger than I am. We were raised like twins, enmeshed sort of in the way that kids who grew up in sort of a chaotic situation can be. And I've been dreaming about him lately. In my dreams, he's not dead. He's either hiding or faking, and I'm desperately trying to find him. In one dream, I've been abandoned by my ride in Quebec, of all places. A place I've never even been. I have no money. My high school French is worthless, but I have to find him. He's somewhere. He's on an island, and I have to get there. He's alone, and I hate that he's alone. Of course, I'm frustrated with him, as I was sometimes in life. I'm angry in the dream where he faked his death, of course, but I'm also so relieved that he's alive. He's alive. I believed he was dead, and he's alive. And then I wake up. Not too long ago, my brother had a dream. It was about sauteed asparagus. He called me about it because I was in it.
Hey, I just woke up because I just had the best dream of my entire life, and you were part of it. It had to deal with me making sauteed asparagus. But I want you to know that you're so important to me. You're even with me in my dream.
I'm so important to him, he said, that I'm with him. even in his dreams. Having someone in your life for most of your life who thinks you're that important, that's pretty great. It was great. And now he's just dead. His story is somehow over. And all that's left is this grief during a pandemic. What do you do about that? What do we do about that? My brother didn't die of COVID. Turns out he died of a subdural hematoma, likely as a result of a childhood injury. But that doesn't mean his death wasn't a COVID death. In the days before he died in his sleep, he experienced headaches, apparently bad enough to warrant medical attention, but he wouldn't go to the hospital because he didn't want to be alone, as COVID protocols then required. And if he was sick enough to die, he didn't want to die alone. Now, I didn't know any of this, or I would have driven to Houston and taken him to the hospital myself. But I didn't know. Rick Holter said just a few minutes ago, don't beat yourself up. It's difficult not to beat yourself up, you know? So I'm trying. I'm still putting one foot in front of the other. We're all grieving. It's okay to not be okay. One foot in front of the other. Let's be kind to each other and try to give each other a little grace, if we can. This episode of Petrie Dish was produced by Dominic Anthony Walsh and me. Our sound designer is Jacob Rosati. Our executive producer is Fernanda Camarena. Special thanks this week to KERA's Vice President of News, Rick Holter, reporters Stella Chavez and Mallory Falk, and thanks to producer Lucy Wong for their contributions to the show. TPR's news director is Dan Katz. Mark Memmott is managing editor of the Texas Newsroom. This podcast is a production of TPR and the Texas Newsroom, a collaboration between public radio stations across Texas and NPR. I'm Bonnie Petrie. Talk to you soon.